So great to see all of you tonight. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining for the brand called You, helping women self-promote. If you haven't yet, make sure you take a moment to say hi in the chat. Let us know a favorite holiday song, favorite holiday movie, so we can all get in the holiday spirit now that we're in the last month of 2021. My name is Kylie Davidson. I'm the coordinator of the Alison R Bernstein Media Mentoring Program, and I'm thrilled to kick things off tonight. Together, we are going to dive into the how and the why of self-promotion. And we are so very lucky to have Angela Scalpello guide us through this work. And I'm even a bit luckier because I have the privilege of introducing her to all of you. Angela is an accomplished global executive coach to C-suite executives and their teams, helping them unlock their leadership power to deliver on their strategic and personal objectives. She has helped CEOs transform their companies, provided insight to senior executives in finance, marketing, HR, technology, and security to align their individual goals with the company's strategy, and also worked with teams to transform them into high-performing teams. Angela's skill in working with leaders to drive significant business transformation is delivered from her experiences across industries, companies, and organizations. She's seen as a trusted advisor and sounding board. Most recently, Angela was Senior Vice President of Organizational and Learning Development for UBM, now part of Informa, one of the largest global business-to-business event organizers in the world. She's held other senior human resources positions for companies such as PR Newswire, UBM Tech, Ogilvy Public Relations, and Ogilvy Advertising. Angela is passionate about helping individuals and teams develop the capabilities they and their organizations need to enhance their success. She's developed and facilitated leadership training sessions around the world and is a sought-after speaker on topics such as employee engagement, career development, organizational culture, emotional IQ, developing female leaders, and inclusion and belonging. Angela is certified in conversational IQ, which she uses to help individuals and teams create trusting relationships. These relationships in turn build healthy cultures that unlock co-creation, innovation, and transformation. She's currently being certified in the 4 Rooms of Change methodology to help individuals and organizations successfully move through the stages of change. Angela is on the board of the Business Council for Peace, or BPeace, and also a member of the advisory board of the Institute for Women's Leadership at Rutgers University. She lives in Brooklyn, where she baked way too much zucchini nut bread and banana bread during the pandemic, and I would like the recipes for both of those, please. But we're just so fortunate to have Angela for this workshop, and I'm so excited, as I know all of you are as well, to learn from her expertise. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Angela, and I will kick it over to you, Angela, to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Kylie. I really appreciate that. Note to self, edit that bio. It's a little bit too long. In any case, I recognize some of these faces. They're familiar, and they're faces I recognized from some of the other sessions. I'm thrilled to be here. And this topic is really near and dear to my heart. And it first became something of interest to me when I did a workshop at a conference, and the people in the audience were all senior female executives. And I did an overview on how to be deliberate and intentional in managing your career. And there was one slide about self-promotion. And it was probably the slide that got the most attention in the conversations afterwards. And women who I knew to be really successful, having big jobs, big roles, a large span of authority and control, admitting that that was the thing they felt the least comfortable doing. And in fact, felt that they did it really badly. So tonight, hopefully, what we're going to do is we're going to get a chance to learn a different way to view self-promotion and also to do self-promotion. So without further ado, I'm going to start sharing my slides. As I often say, I'm a New Yorker and I talk fast and I have a Brooklyn accent. So if at any point in time you don't understand what I'm saying because of those two things, please reach out to Kylie, who will interrupt me. And if for whatever reason I say something or I share a concept that I'm not explaining well enough or that you'd like greater clarity about, do the same, and Kylie will interrupt me. This is not my workshop. This is your workshop. I'm just facilitating, and so I want to make sure that you get the most out of it. Okay, so share my screen. So I call this the brand called you because it really is understanding and seeing yourself the way we see brands. And brands are very familiar in our lives. And so my idea was if we could see ourselves as a brand, then we could see how to market, or in other terminology, self promote. And the reason I picked this is because I often thought that for some women, as they go into the corporate world or start their careers, that maybe the last time they actually felt good and free to sort of toot their own horn was the day they graduated, because it was almost as if they were given permission to celebrate their accomplishments. So today, what we're going to do is learn how to self promote in a way that is genuine and that is impactful and yet feels comfortable to you and to your audience, because it doesn't sound rehearsed or smug. It doesn't make you feel as if you're sort of Ron Burgundy. I'm kind of a big deal around here. My books are leather bound, and the feeling that somehow promoting yourself is not something that one should do. And I want to talk also about how do you reframe what you do to what you're doing, and also take away some of the myths that we have about self promotion. Now, if we were together, and I can't wait for the day when we can all be face to face, I would have asked you to put together the rules of engagement for our time together. And so, because we're not, I put some together that hopefully aren't too onerous. The first is, well, in fact, I'm going to start at the bottom. To be honest in not only what you share in the group, also to be honest with yourself, right? To acknowledge what you need to be better at, what you need to develop, or what you need to do differently moving forward. Also, to be honest when you talk to the people in your breakout group, and to ask and receive feedback in a way that helps yourself. I think being curious and being open are linked, because if you're curious, you're often open to what it is that you're learning. And then the final one, which was the one we started with, was to be present, right? The CEO of Microsoft says that in the past, computing power was limited. And today, now that it's limitless, what the real scarcity is human attention. So give yourself the gift of being present for our time together so that you can get the most out of it. So, a brief agenda overview. I want to put this topic in context and share some research about the gender differences between how men and women share. Of course, we'll talk about seeing yourself as a brand. And then again, as I said earlier, if we can reframe self promotion as just a story that you tell about yourself, it helps it feel more comfortable. What are the attributes of a really powerful story? And then we're going to do a breakout session where you're going to get a chance to practice articulating your own story. And then we'll end with just a few pieces of advice and a few things to keep in mind. So before we get into the guts of tonight's session, I want to share a story. And this topic is personal to me because of something that happened to me as a 16-year-old young woman. I honestly believe that I had one of the most loving and supportive and wonderful fathers that any young woman could ask for. My father, along with my mother, believed that anything that their daughters wanted to do was possible. And so growing up, I felt that my possibilities were limitless and that I could do anything I wanted. And I knew that my parents were proud of me. They often told me that. But something happened one day, and I can actually picture it, even though I haven't lived in that house in more than 40 years. And that is that I must have been having one of those days that we have as young people where you feel full of yourself and you're sort of like just bursting out of your skin and you're loud and you're boisterous. And my father, who again, as I said, was kind and warm and gentle and supportive, he looked at me. It was on the top of the back stairs. And he said to me, "Who do you think you are?" And it stopped me in my tracks. And so later in life, when I would want to put myself forward for something, when I would want to sort of take a risk to stretch and do something, for the longest time, I heard my father's voice in my head saying, "Who do you think you are?" So maybe you don't have that experience. However, I think for many of us, there's something in our past, sometimes something in our social um, acclimation to what it's like to be a woman in this world, that we get this impression that we've got to be smaller than we really are. And so today I want to disabuse us of that and give us some tools in order to be proud of who we are and to be able to say it and to say it in a way that resonates. So what I'm going to ask you to do, there's a chat function. I mean, we're like Zoom experts. So I'm going to ask you to read this list, right? I want you to rate your self-promotion ability and your comfort level in promoting, right? So all you need to do is honestly in the chat, just put the number that you relate to, right? Are you sort of more of the, I only do it if I have no choice? Or I'm okay, but I could be better, or I'd rather crawl into a hole than self promote. So, where do you see yourself? So, put your number in the chat. Okay, I'm going to ask Kylie to give me a sense of what it looks like, how it's trending.
Yeah, we started out with some fours. I'm okay, but I could be much better. But then a few threes. I do it reluctantly and badly. And then a few who put themselves in a 1 to 2 range. I'd rather crawl into a hole than self promote, or I only do it if I have no choice. But I don't think there was a single 5 out of the group.
Okay, so that's good for that person because then I would just hand over control of the PowerPoint and they could do this workshop. So it's true, most people would do anything other than self-promote, and then some realize the necessity of it and say, "I do it, but pretty reluctantly." And some people say, "You know what? I'm okay. I think I'm okay, but I'm sure I could be much better." So let's look at what the research tells us and why it matters. This was a joint research project between the Harvard Business School and Wharton, which, as we know, is the business school at the University of Pennsylvania. And what they were trying to figure out was, are there gender differences in how men self-evaluate and how women self-evaluate? Now, they were very clear in talking about the difference between objective self-evaluation versus subjective self-evaluation. So think of it this way. Your boss comes to you and says, "What were your sale numbers like last quarter?" And you can say objectively, they were 20% higher than the quarter before. Or what is the market share of the product we launched last year, right? That's what we call objective self evaluation, where you have quantitative data that you can use. And all of us feel pretty comfortable talking about that and talking about ourselves in that way. But what the researchers were interested in finding out is what happens when you say to a woman, "How well do you think you're doing in your current job? How well do you think your sales force is? That's where the gender differences start to show up. And this is what the research looked like. They used the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery Test. And that's a test that the Army uses and a lot of researchers use. The Army uses it to determine what's the best role for an individual. And it has math and it has science. It's basically how they measure cognitive ability for people coming into the armed services. And there are 20 questions on the test. The first question the researchers asked the men and the women were, how many do you think you answered correctly? Now, interestingly enough, the men and the women answered about the same number of questions correctly. The men answered, on average, they answered around 10 questions correctly. The women answered 10 questions. The men, more men, answered 9 questions correctly. However, when they asked the men and the women how they think they did on this test, the men rated their performance 33% higher than equally performing women on the test. Now, they wanted to dig into this and see if there were other factors that came into play. And so what they did is they took that test and they turned it into a 1 to 100 scale. And what they said was, okay, rate your performance on a scale of 1 to 100. The women rated themselves 46. The men rated themselves 61. Then they told them how you answer this, how you self-evaluate will determine whether you get hired and what we will pay you. Okay, so that's what we call self-interested, right? So even when there's self-interest in promoting yourself more because you know it's going to determine whether you're going to get a job and what they're going to pay you, the women rated themselves significantly lower. Now, this is the one that fascinated me the most. They looked at what they called informed and non-informed responses. So when they said this will determine whether you get hired and what we will pay you, neither the men nor the women knew what their actual scores were. They then told the men and the women what their actual scores were, and then asked them to self-evaluate, and the women still evaluated their performance lower than the men. Now, when they were told that how they self-rated could possibly be seen by the people who were thinking to hire them, and they could also see what they actually scored, both men and women rated themselves lower, in essence, not wanting to be outed. But again, significantly, the women rated themselves lower. And the significance of this is when you stop and think how many times in the workplace, especially, you're asked to self-evaluate, to ask how you're doing, right? To evaluate how you did in a meeting, how the client meeting went, right? They couldn't link it to confidence because when they informed the women that in essence they were the same scores, as they had earned the same scores as men, and in fact slightly higher, it wasn't a matter of confidence because now women knew that they had performed well quantitatively, right? So what was it? And the researchers have said basically that they're still not sure, they're still doing more, but they know that it's there. And so what is it that we need to do? Do we stop self-evaluations? Do employers look for something other than this subjective way that we rate ourselves, knowing that the research backs up the fact that men and women rate themselves very differently? Now, the Centers for Leadership in Washington, D.C., did a whole body of work about what are the building blocks of job and career success. And they said there were 3 things that working together would make you unstoppable. It was ability, ambition, and engagement. They were all important. 3 of them working together would make you unstoppable. There was one that was most important, or was more important than the others. And I'd like you to put in the chat what you think was the most important in terms of career building blocks and job success. So what are we seeing, Kylie?
I think engagement takes it, but ambition is a close second.
Okay, so I'm almost embarrassed to tell you how long I've been asking people this question. Engagement is really important. Engagement with your team, engagement with your colleagues, right? Ambition is really important. People knowing that you want to move ahead. The most important one on this list is ability, because unless you're doing the job for which I hired you really well, if you just have ambition but not the ability, then you're an incompetent dreamer. And if you have engagement and ambition but no ability, well, you're an incompetent dreamer who gets along with people on your team. And so it's really important that first you prove you do your job, and then, and this is tonight's conversation, how do you articulate what you want and why it is that you deserve that raise, that promotion, that stretch assignment, that bonus? And so let's start looking at this through the lens of brands. Now, many of us are very brand loyal, right? We only drink Starbucks, or we only drink Lavazza coffee, or we only drink Lipton tea, or we only use Kellogg cereal, or whatever it is. Many of us are brand loyal. And the way that people look at brands, right? And I was lucky enough to work for one of the big companies that dealt with brands, Ogilvy Advertising, was where does this brand add value? And how does it, in essence, fulfill a need or answer an aspiration? And so where brands add value is that they create recognition and differentiation, right? We choose one brand over the other. We recognize the brand and we see it as better than and different from something else. It's also about how brands are credible, right? They create trust because of consistency. You want to keep using that brand because it's familiar and it's consistent. And the same thing with why people would want to work with you. Also, brands create loyalty because they deliver on their brand promise, right? Mr. Clean, Swiffer, whatever it is that you think of when you think of some familiar brands, they create loyalty because they deliver on the promise that they make. And the same thing with you as a brand. You're given more opportunities because you've delivered on what it is you say you'll do. And brands also create cheerleaders. How many times do we share excitedly through social media channels or in conversation something we've discovered or something that we're loyal to? However, when we think about self-promoting and thinking of ourselves as a brand, we have to be careful of these self-promotion myths and concerns. So the first myth is that my work speaks for myself. And I've seen that writ large in my corporate career, where women sit quietly and wait for their work to speak for themselves. But that doesn't happen, right? Only you can speak for yourself. The other one is my boss knows what I'm doing. And years ago, the former chairman of the board of Deloitte said that she learned that lesson early when she was passed over for promotion And she finally got up the nerve to ask her boss and said to him, basically, I don't know why I didn't get that promotion. I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. My team has accomplished this. We've done this. And he looked at her and he said, why didn't you tell me? Right? So don't always assume that your boss knows what you're doing. Although we're going to talk later about having other people be able to, in essence, brag on your behalf, don't assume that other people will do it for you. Because if they don't, then no one is sharing all the good things that you're doing. Some people feel, in essence, that self-promotion just sounds nicer than bragging. It's just a euphemism for bragging. And then the other is that people sort of say, I don't want to be that person. Because there is some blowback depending on how you self-promote. And so people feel as if it's unseemly. However, unless you can self-promote, look at these questions. What are you going to do when somebody says, tell me about yourself? Or you go to a meetup or you go to the beginning of a class and someone says, why don't you introduce yourself to the group? Why do you deserve? Your boss says, why do you deserve this raise, this promotion, this budget, this head count, this assignment? What is it exactly that you do? So let's make it a little bit easier. Let's stop for a minute and think about self-promotion as telling a story. So think for a minute about stories and storytelling. Anyone who's telling a story, first of all, has to think, who is my audience, right? Who is my audience? Who am I speaking to? A compelling story has movement and it has emotion. It pulls you in. It also is an authentic story. You can only tell your own story authentically, and your own story is rich enough. The other part is, can I be vulnerable? The one thing that connects us, despite any differences that we have, is our humanity. And our humanity is about vulnerability and failure. And vulnerability is what creates trust. And when someone trusts you, they trust you as a storyteller. It's also whether or not your story is relatable. And that goes back to the first point, which is, do I know my audience? And what do I tell this audience in a way that they'll say, ah, I see myself in that story, or I understand what it is that she's talking about. And then finally, why should they care about my story? What does it tell me? What does it teach me? And what is it that I need to know? And when you think about something we're going to be doing in a little while, when you think about developing your story, stories sometimes have a backstory, right? Once upon a time, right? Before I joined this firm, before I was married, before I became successful. And in addition to the backstory, a story is about a journey, right? It often has obstacles overcome. It has accomplishments. It has what we call grist or juxtaposition. Grist or juxtaposition. I was this, I'm now this. I failed many times until finally I met this mentor who helped me succeed, right? So there's some tension and there's some grist and there's maybe a before and an after. There's also a way to share what you've learned on this journey. And then the best and richest stories, right, pull all those threads together. How many times have you read a review of a book where they say the ending was very abrupt, right? They seem to want to tie up loose ends really badly. But if you tell your story in a way that is authentic and is relatable and rich with imagery and is something that your audience cares about, the threads in essence will be easy to pull at the end of the story. Now, before we do the breakout, I want to talk about a tale of two tales. What you do versus what you are doing. If I had been asked when I was working at UBM Global, what do you do? And I had said, I'm the Senior Vice President of Organizational and Leadership Development. That told you nothing about me or what it was that I was doing. It's a much richer response. Instead of saying what you do in terms of giving a title, is talk about what you're doing. Much more compelling to say, I am creating an organization that has capabilities that are aligned with our global strategy and that allow our people to achieve their business goals. I am a senior VP for a large global events organization. Okay, that's a title. What answer B would be is I'm working to bring buyers and sellers together in a global marketplace so they can create relationships and build business, right? So this idea of what you do versus what you're doing, right? I could say that I'm a coach, or I could say I'm helping people perform better than they even know that they can. So we're going to go into breakout sessions, and the question is, what is your story? You're going to spend 20 minutes working on your story, sharing your story, asking each other questions, refining your stories with all the things we just talked about, what you do versus what you're doing, what your backstory is, right? Where's the movement? Where's the journey? However you think you could tell your authentic story. And if you want, you can use the prompts that are on this screen, right? Pick a prompt that is something that you're going to be faced with, right? Like maybe you're getting ready to ask for a raise or a promotion. How will you respond? Why do you deserve this? Or if you've got something coming up where you're going to have to introduce yourself to the group, or maybe this one, which we get in many different circumstances, tell me about yourself. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Does anyone have any questions before we go into breakout rooms? Okay. Okay, it looks like we're all back in, which makes me very happy. I don't know if any of you saw that commercial for that movie where these people get off a plane and they're like, why were we taken off this plane? What's going on? And the person says, you got on this plane 5 years ago. Where have you been those 5 years? And I think to myself, what if I send people into Zoom rooms and then they don't come back? Like, you know, Loretta and Gabrielle and Emily and Celise, you have to live together for the next 5 years in a little triangle. So in any case, I'm happy to see that you're all back. And I meant to ask Kylie for permission, but I think she'll be okay that I say this. Poor Kylie was stuck with me in a breakout room. You never want to be left with the instructor in a breakout room. So I said to her, okay, tell me about yourself. What is it that you do? And I loved it because, as many of you know, Kylie's title is program director, but she started out in a way that, like, she had me a community builder. She said, I'm a community builder. And that reaction to me is really, without saying it out loud, tell me more. right? And that's what you want your opening to be. Tell me more. So who wants to unmute themselves and either share what happened in their group or share what they worked on or what they learned? Don't be shy. Also be aware that I had 13 years of education with nuns, and I am not afraid to call on people.
I think we had a good breakout room. We started, it was myself, it was Lisa, Beth, and and Dana. Okay, her screen's not on. But we started out all talking about what are we doing? That was something that really resonated with us, especially Lisa and I, and Dana went into it. But then Beth kind of shifted the conversation to why do you deserve that conversation? Because as we know, like we're kind of in this area of budgeting right now, with their companies and asking for, budget for certain things. And it was a really interesting conversation around, how do we measure what we're doing and what we're not doing with the budget that we could have. So that I thought that was a really interesting conversation. And I don't know, Beth, if you wanted to go into it more, but it ended with kind of like a brainstorm, and Dana just had a similar situation happen at her job, and now we're getting into this brainstorming of how we can, support Beth in why she deserves this budget after she tells us about the why, what is she doing. So I think we hit on a few points, and it was an interactive conversation, and I think we all learned something from it.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. Beth, did you want to add to that?
No, I think Rachel knocked it out of the park. I would say that like what we're doing is also grounded in like why did we decide to do this? Like, what was our personal why, or why did we help our company do this? Like, that was how we framed the what, is actually in like the business case of the why or our personal why. And so I thought that was also super helpful.
Thank you, Beth. It's funny that you say that, because after Kylie went into her, what she's doing, I said, what drew you to this role? Right? And then that's also another opening for some rich storytelling. When I would interview senior executives, I have an example from interviewing a CFO, and I said to him, I can read your resume, but I want you to tell me who you are as if it's a story. And I said, so for example, did you sit on the edge of your bed, swing your legs saying, one day I want to be a CFO, one day I want to be a CFO? And he said, no, he said, but I grew up really working class. And my uncle, my father's brother, was an accountant, and they had a much nicer house. They went on nice vacations, and they had a nice car. And I thought, I want that life for myself. And it just so happened that luckily I was good at math. Right? What did I learn about him? I learned so much about him. He's a striver. Right? He was self-aware even as a young child. So that's a great follow-up question, and also being able to answer that kind of follow-up question. Who else wants to share? So shy. Are you waiting for me to call on you? Okay, I thought I saw Lisa unmuting. Go ahead.
Of course you saw me unmuting. Hi, I'm Lisa. So I was just going to say, in our group, when we were trying to come up with like the develop your story part, the tell me about yourself section or storytelling, it was important for me. I thought, okay, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So I thought, let me start at the beginning. When I was younger, I always wanted to be in magazines. Like, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I love the written word. And then I moved into where I landed, and then what I learned, and basically kind of like where I want to go. So that's kind of how I framed it. And that's actually kind of how I did it in my interview like this past week. So I'm hoping that it kind of like didn't just tug at the heartstrings, but it kind of gives the other person a way to connect, which I think is super important as a copywriter. And just also as a human being, I think everyone just needs connection. So for me, that connection part is ideal in creating that storytelling for how, like, tell me about yourself, essentially.
Right, exactly. Thanks, Lisa. So on the slide before we went into breakout, the tell me what you do versus tell me what you're doing. I said I'm the example A was I'm the senior VP of a global event organization, right? Think of how different it is if someone was to say, like, what do you do? And like, how did you get into this? If the person starts the story this way, it's no surprise to me that basically what I do is bring a lot of people together. Because as a little girl, I was the person who was always organizing trips to the park, plays in the backyard. And so now I do it and I get paid to do it, and people come together to conduct business. And so, in essence, it's an extension of me doing what I've always loved. Now, I also mentioned to Kylie in our breakout, don't underestimate the power of questions, either as the storyteller or as someone listening to a story, right? So when I told you the story about my father, and that's a true story, right? I ended it by saying, I don't know if this has ever happened to any of you, but I'm pretty sure that we've all had that experience of questioning whether we deserve what it is that we want. I was in an interview for a project, to be hired for a project with an investment bank. And they asked me about my background. And they said, you know what, Angela? We're concerned because you've never worked for an investment bank. And instead of saying, yeah, you're right, I never worked for an investment bank as a client, I said to them, what do you think defines an investment banker? And they said, well, they think they're the smartest person in the room. They're very achievement oriented. They can be arrogant. And I said, okay. I said, I've never worked for an investment banking firm. I said, but I've worked with surgeons. Surgeons are very smart. They're very achievement oriented. They need to be the smartest person in the room, and they have a big ego. I think that sounds pretty similar to your investment bankers, right? So don't be afraid, even in storytelling, to engage in dialogue. Any questions before we move on? Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Start sharing my screen, I should say. So a few things to keep in mind. Avoid the humble brag. Now, a humble brag is a brag shrouded in humility, which it isn't. Like, oh, I can't believe I have to go to 2 Emmy Award ceremonies. That means 2 dresses, right? That's a humble brag. I'm so tired because everyone wants my time, right? So it's really distasteful to people. And the research shows that people rank or rate a humble brag more harshly than they do somebody who just openly brags. The other is that the research shows that there's no penalty to self promote when asked, right? So the questions that we went over, right? Tell me about yourself, or what have you accomplished this year? Or what are you and your team proudest of? There's no penalty, there's no social penalty for doing it when you're asked. And so take the opportunity. The research also shows that sharing when others are sharing is also seen more favorably. So when other people are sharing their accomplishments, that you jumping in an appropriate way to also share yours is totally appropriate, and it doesn't have any blowback. Interestingly enough, this works with humans, and also the research was done with a computer and a person. And even when the computer bragged, Like I have more capacity than I even ever use, or I have a very large hard drive, right? The person on the other end of the computer felt comfortable themselves self-promoting. Now, this find a promoter is really important. Listen to the difference. If I say, let me think of how to put this. Anyone who has ever worked with me would say that I'm a natural leader. How different does it sound if someone who's worked with me says, everyone who's worked with Angela calls her a natural leader? So find people in your circle. This doesn't abdicate responsibility for you being able to self-promote, but when appropriate, make sure that your boss, your mentor, your sponsors, your colleagues who know the value of what you do can also do it in a way that promotes your capabilities. It's why when I try and help people find jobs or make connections, I ask for their blurb as to what they do, and then I put all the promotion around that. Having worked with the X, Y, and Z, I know how easy she is to work with, how collaborative, and how innovative, right? It would sound very differently if the person wrote a note and said, I'm very collaborative, I'm very innovative, and I'm a pleasure to work with. The other thing is to do what we call strike a balance. It's putting the good and the bad. And the example that I read, I found was really helpful. It was an investment banker making a pitch and not saying, I'm the best, everyone wants to work with me, but starting out by saying, when I first started working with companies, I wasn't that great at it. I didn't really understand how important it was to understand the value that the owner put on the company that he might have nurtured. But over time, I got much better at it. So sometimes juxtaposition your vulnerabilities with your strengths, people remember the strengths, and in some ways it highlights them even more. And then to celebrate in the right way. Not that celebrating could ever have a wrong way, I guess, but basically when you want to feel good about your accomplishments or your achievements, celebrate with a select group of people who you know are really happy for your success. Also celebrate yourself, right? If you don't have a group of people to celebrate with, right, commend yourself, congratulate yourself. One of the women I was reading about has a file where when she gets compliments or nice emails, she sort of saves them or puts them in an electronic file. So on those days when she's feeling low or when she's self-doubting, she has something to refer to remind herself of all the things that she's done and all the things she's accomplished. And finally, I would want to leave you with, before we break for questions, with this in mind. There's an entire book written and it's called The Knowing and Doing Gap. So what we say and what we do. We often tell ourselves, I want more responsibility. We sometimes feel that we're not being fully utilized. We have an ambition to have greater industry visibility. And as you progress in your career, you think to yourself, I deserve that promotion. So what are you going to do differently to get the outcome that you want? And one of the things you have to do is be able to tell a story about yourself in a way that promotes your brand and that helps you get the things that you deserve. So with that, I say this every time I do a workshop for Rutgers. If you have any questions, You know how to reach me. Emily knows how to reach me. Kylie knows how to reach me. Lisa Hetfield knows how to reach me. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Happy to jump on a call or have a conversation. Again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. Happy holidays. And here's to a great 2022 to all of you and all your loved ones. It's been a real honor to be with you this evening.